Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Thinking Out Loud podcast. For today's episode, we have Tom Ginsburg, who's a law professor here at the University of Chicago, focusing on constitutional work. And he's also the chair of the Forum for Free and Clear Expression here at the University of Chicago, and someone I admire as carrying the university's work for free speech forward. So, Professor, you want to introduce yourself?
Great. Thanks for having me, Eduardo. As you said, my name is Tom Ginsburg. I work on comparative and international law, focusing on national constitutions. And now increasingly, I'm interested in comparative free speech issues, just because it's such an important issue for constitutional democracy.
Yeah. And, I want to dive a little deeper into the forum for a second. So, U Chicago basically forever has been seen as the beacon of free speech among top academia institutions. And of course, we have the Chicago Principles being written out around 10 years ago in 2015. And 2 and something years ago, the Forum for Free and Clear Expression was created. And of course, you're the chair for it. So, just for the audience, pretty briefly, what does the forum do, and how does it help carry the principles, the Chicago principles that were put out 10 years ago?
Yeah. So, as you note, the University of Chicago has a really long tradition. It actually goes back, we've learned, all the way to the founding, and I can talk more about that. But the forum is our generation's contribution to this tradition. And it was started by President Olivisatos soon after he arrived here. In 2022, he asked me to set something like this up. In 2023, we had our formal launch. And then in 2024, we got a very large donation from an anonymous donor, which is going to allow us to endow the project and take it forward, hopefully in perpetuity. And its mission is the understanding, practice, and advancement of free expression. So that means doing research. In University of Chicago, the core value
Yeah.
is doing research, trying to understand exactly how we speak to each other, how we can live together in a democracy, how technology interacts with free expression, those kind of things. Practice is to give students and faculty opportunities to talk to each other across difference and get the benefit of free expression. And then advancement really involves trying to push back on some of the forces of illiberalism that we see in American society and ultimately in many countries around the world. So we
Yeah.
want to take the work outside the university context.
And how do you see the forum being different from other initiatives the University of Chicago had? So, we have many speakers coming along, and we have this culture that allows for students in a coffee, in a coffee table to have good discussions. And obviously, we have the Institute of Politics. What do you say you want the forum to represent in U Chicago?
Well, I think it is good to have a place that sort of embodies the tradition. And I often say that free speech isn't really free. It doesn't happen on its own. You need structures to do that. You need opportunities, and you need some ground rules, obviously, for those productive conversations, which is what we're thinking about in the university context. It's not simply a free for all where everyone says whatever they want all the time. We have rules all over the place, constraints all over the place. But within those constraints, we think that we can advance the development of ideas, which is what we're in the business of producing, through vigorous debate. That's the culture of the university. And so we're another place where that happens. We're not the only place. And we partner with all kinds of institutions across campus, including the IOP, when we can. And but each has their own sort of particular focus. One of the things we're trying to do, particularly with the large gift, is to distribute power a bit throughout the university. So empowering students in various corners of the university to design their own events, to think about the issues which are controversial in their particular context, and to think about how we can advance discussion of those issues in the university. We also try to empower faculty. So we have a big research program. Every year we give away significant amounts of money to faculty who are engaged in research projects. So it's kind of a center or a hub for a lot of activity in the university.
And of course, I've been to many forum events, and I think they're really great. But how do you see the students engaging with that? Do you think, obviously, U Chicago has this culture of free speech that is institutional, right? So we have the Chicago Principles, we have the forum. How do you see the students reacting to that? Because for once, the Fire organization put out the report a few weeks ago, I believe,
Yeah.
and we're number three, which is pretty solid. We were number one for the longest period of time, and then we had a few troubles regarding TPUSA. We went to 30-ish, I
Yeah.
believe, and now we're back to 3. Um, and in that report, I saw something interesting that I think at least a quarter of students were okay with using violence to stop a speaker from speaking at UChicago,
Yeah.
which kind of surprised me because obviously there's a few outliers, but I thought I would never think a quarter of students would be thinking something like that. It's I don't know if it's a quarter, but like a significant number of students. How do you see that free speech culture coming in from bottom up, right, from the individual student?
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out. Was a very disturbing finding. So even
Yeah,
we were number 3 in the country. I think they gave us like a C ranking in some sort of
that's right.
absolute
Yeah,
scale. And what I guess that's saying is like the whole country,
yeah.
student culture.
I know the average grade was an F.
I know, I know. And so there's something disturbing about
Yeah.
a culture, a broader culture, in which people think it's okay to shout down a speaker.
Hmm.
That's just never should never be allowed in a university
Yeah.
because, of course, and it's so obvious, but it bears repeating. When you shout down a speaker, you're saying that not only is the speaker a problem, but the listeners are too dumb to make their own judgment about the speech that was
It's
going to be
true.
given.
Yeah.
So it's a very patronizing thing to do. And it's disturbing that such a high percentage of young people think that's okay. Now, I don't know how robust that result is. I don't know the
Hmm.
way the question was
Yeah.
asked. And in general, the fire rankings, we don't give much credence to. I don't,
Hmm.
because,
No, no, but that's everyone's baseline for free speech in America, right? If you
yeah,
say you Chicago's the home of free speech and we're number 30 something like we were last year,
yeah.
we're gonna be laughed at,
Yeah,
right?
no, that's a problem,
Yeah.
obviously. And then, but you just want to make sure that their methodology is
Of
sound.
course,
And
yeah.
as a social scientist, I've done some work on measurement, and I got all kinds of technical problems with the
Hmm.
way fire is going about it. But the big point is I mean, I think the way you asked the question was right on, because it's like, okay, even if we're number 1, even if we're, the tallest hill
Hmm.
on a very flat, area, and we're
That's
not
right.
that tall, that's not good. In other words, because if the culture is bad, if the culture is one in which people are suppressing each other, then we all suffer.
Yeah.
And so we have to continually work to deepen that culture and to overcome repressive views. Now, I think my experience of the University of Chicago students is that that may be a bit overstated. Certainly not a quarter of the students I've met would agree with that,
Hmm.
including the undergraduates.
Yeah.
But there's always selection processes. I do think because of our history, our 130-year-old history
Yeah.
involving free speech, we have this brand, and the history is amazing in terms of how our predecessors in difficult periods like the 1900s or the 1940s and 50s stood up, for these core values of free inquiry.
Hmm.
I do think we have a bit of a brand, and so we get students who do want to engage with each other across difference. That's sort of seen as an affirmative value. Because if you're
Yeah.
really not into that, you just want to be around people who think about just like you. Yeah, probably University of Chicago is not the right place to come.
Hmm.
So I think that makes it's a bit easier here because we get students who select in. And I'm speaking as a law
It
professor.
is self-selecting, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's true.
And I don't know. Obviously, there's one thing I've learned in this job is that the campus is very diverse, and the
Hmm.
culture in the law school is very different from the culture in. I'll just take the divinity school or Harris or whatever. Each corner has its own
Yeah.
culture, but it would be great if we were all united by this mission, which is core to the university, that inquiry is what we're here for. In other words, we're here for the discovery of knowledge and to train people into how to think.
Hmm.
And that requires a couple of things. It requires a diversity of views, for
Yeah.
sure. You can't just have everyone who already thinks alike. And it also requires structures in which they can debate each other and sharpen each other's ideas.
Hmm.
And that's it. That's the goal. But it doesn't happen automatically. That's my point, that you really got to build up opportunities for people. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, trying to learn how to do.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work. We're far from perfect.
Yeah, of course. The reason we dropped from the top of the pile to 30-ish, I think last year, uh, we had the TPUSA problem a few years ago, but last year we had also the Palestinian protest problem
Yeah.
that a few students didn't get, a few students that were graduating didn't get their degrees because they were involved in the protests.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a couple friends of mine, and that's a reason for a lot of controversy because obviously, expressing free speech should be in the university, but how do you draw that line between free speech and antagonizing other students and walking to classes and occupying the quad?
Yeah.
Um, just wanted to get the feel of how do you see the boundaries of free speech in an academic sense, in an
Oh,
academic setting, I mean, on
yeah.
campus.
Well, it's a great question. So it illustrates that there are boundaries, right?
Hmm.
So, in general, in First Amendment thinking, we want the government to regulate in a way that's what we call content neutral. So we don't want them to allow the march and demonstration by the right wing people and not the left wing people. We want, you want the rules about who can do what in the public park to be content neutral. That's the idea. And we adopt that. That's what the Chicago principles do for the university. They basically say, we're going to act like it's the First Amendment. And that means that, of course, we can have rules. We have time, place, and manner rules about classrooms. You can't just get up in the class and start yelling at your professor. You'd be kicked out of class, and that would be appropriate.
Hmm.
Um, but when it comes to the public spaces, like the quad, we've tended to act as if it was what in First Amendment law would be called a public forum, like a park or
Yeah,
something like
yeah.
that. And that means we're allow many more things to happen, but there are time, place, and manner rules. And it's interesting. After we had the encampment, which some of the students may remember, we had an event for faculty after the encampment was taken down, a
Hmm.
faculty discussion. We didn't allow students because we just thought it was important. The faculty were very divided about that encampment. Let's have a conversation. And it was a really interesting discussion. You had one of my colleagues who was a free speech person and was also on the faculty for Justice in Palestine group said,
Hmm.
hey, it was basically a nonviolent demonstration. Nothing wasn't really disrupting anything. You guys could have moved graduation somewhere else. You should have left up
Hmm.
the encampment. Then you had actually the free speech people who were saying, well, we're content neutral, but you violated the time, place, and manner rules. You're not actually allowed to camp in the quad or to have all night raves in the middle of the public space. And so it shouldn't have been allowed from the beginning. And then actually you had the philosopher Agnes Callard,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
who does the
Hmm.
night owls and stuff. And she had a very interesting take about what was going on. I'm not going to be able to reconstruct it here. But she's like, I don't really know. And she had a very thoughtful response, kind of weighing both sides. And then we had a great faculty discussion about whether or not it should have been taken down. My
Hmm.
own view is, of course, you need time, place, and manner rules. When you have a big political movement like the Palestine movement, you should give them a little more space, and that's what the university did.
Hmm.
Even if they were violating the rules, the university said, "Okay, this is an important public policy issue. We're seeing what's happening on other campuses.
Hmm.
We'll give you a little bit of a break." And
Yeah.
they were allowed to stay up, as you know, for 9 days.
Just going.
So if Turning Point USA, um, decides they want to have a camp out in the quad and and so on, and just and have daily demonstrations, they could do it too,
Hmm.
even if they were violating the rules, because we have to regulate neutrally. If we're going to let the Palestine people do that, we'd have to let the TPOSA people do it.
Hmm.
And I made this argument quite often to my colleagues, and I think that's the case. So there was kind of a bending over backwards to let them speak by the administration. I'm of course not an administrator at all. I was not
Yeah.
involved in any of these discussions. I'm just a faculty member.
Hmm.
But I do think it was good to let people have their say. And then eventually they did, close down the encampment with no arrests. From
Hmm.
my point of view, it was a very, you know, the whole thing was somewhat of a performance in a sense. Like the protesters could feel aggrieved that their free speech was was shut down, and the university looked tough. But at the end of the day, it was a nonviolent thing on
Yeah.
both sides, and that's fine. Like compared with the other universities, I think it went down pretty well here. We did allow them to speak. Now, what's the I think in general, like the time, place, and manner rules are really important. And one thing that I think did hurt us that year was that there had been an earlier incident where students had taken over a building and
Hmm.
gotten arrested. So, from my point of view, voluntarily, like they knew they would be arrested if they stayed, and they got
Yeah.
arrested. So, civil disobedience kind of thing. And the disciplinary process was so slow that this is my understanding. Again, I'm not an administrator. This is what, but my understanding from what I've learned, the disciplinary process was so slow that it only played out like that week before graduation, and that's why those students had their diplomas suspended for a week. But in
Hmm.
the end, that wasn't a very good decision. They should have just let those students walk, and because they did end up giving them the diplomas the next
That's right.
week.
Yeah.
So the whole thing was just like a
A performative.
well, it was a kind of yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the students were aggrieved, and they used it for sort of advancement of their cause. But at the end, it was just a silly thing for the university to do. If you're gonna not give them their diplomas, well, decide not to give them their diplomas. But to delay it just was like the worst of all worlds. So
Hmm.
I didn't think that played out very well. In
Yeah.
general, we have to have structure. That's the basic thing. But we also have to give students opportunities. And, last year, a year ago, there was a more violent demonstration where the students were, gotten physical altercations with police and threw
Hmm.
paint on the Henry Moore sculpture and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And those are, of course, appropriate cases for discipline. I would like all that energy to come into discussion.
That's right.
Hey, Israel Palestine's a complicated problem. There's a lot of history and it's a lot of horrible things that have gone on both sides. There's like no, there's plenty of blame to go around. So, how do we talk about that and how do we teach people about it? That's what the job of the university is. And the forum, we did a few events on it.
Hmm.
So, we tried to channel some of that energy, including one, by the way, that was disrupted. We had the Palestinian Prime Minister, Salam
Oh,
Fayyad, was here, and I was in conversation with him.
interesting.
But
And
that was ultimately disrupted briefly.
yeah.
Um,
And how do you deal with these disruptions? Because I went to another IOP event on, we were talking about ICE and the immigration here in Chicago, and a bunch of protesters just kept interrupting the person who was talking, and the administrators of the event couldn't do anything because they felt like kicking them out or escorting them out or doing anything would go against the principles. How do you deal with those disruptions,
yeah, it's interesting. We
like
haven't.
at
Yeah,
impromptu, like?
yeah. Well, so in this case, you have a big room full of people. Hundreds
Mm,
of people are there to listen to the Palestinian Prime Minister. We had security and deans on call. That's what they're called.
yeah. Hmm.
And they're trained to deal with this. So if you think an issue is going to be controversial, we would try to have a dean on call there, and they will, not violently go up to the person and say, please be quiet. When they're not quiet, please leave. And then if someone really won't leave, they would escort them out. That's how it works. But I used that one as an opportunity to talk. So basically people were screaming, and I was like, okay. I let them scream for a little, but then I just talked and I tried to explain why it is that disruption is bad, that it's patronizing to everyone else in the room, and it's violating the rights of the listener,
Hmm.
not just the speaker. By the way, Frederick Douglass said exactly that when you disrupt, you're violating not just the rights of the speaker, but the rights of the hearer and the listener. And he's absolutely right. So I gave a little talk about that,
Hmm.
and eventually the people were removed, and they got to say their thing. Um, Salam was disturbed. He had never been protested in his life, and
Really?
this was the pro-Palestine people who were protesting him.
Mm,
So that's what he said. He never experienced anything like that. So,
yeah.
we're University of Chicago. We have to enforce those rules, of course, because it's a funny thing about rules. This is something we talk about in constitutional theory.
Hmm.
Rules actually facilitate freedom. Like, you need structure in order to have a conversation. And if anyone can get up in any class, and yell at any time they want without any sanction, well, that's disrupting the learning. You need some
Hmm.
basic norms in order to have a classroom. So university is full of rules. I guess my big thing about it all is that inquiry is the first value of the University of Chicago in particular. We
Yeah.
were set up to
Yeah.
discover things, and so our free speech rules have to be in service of that, and they have to allow protests when there are big social and political issues. But those have to be, within boundaries, obviously.
Yeah.
And you can never allow any violence, and you can never allow a disruption of a speaker.
Hmm. And yeah, that's pretty interesting. And in terms of international students, right? So we had, I think it was in May or April of this year, we had the cases of a few international students around the country. I think one in Chicago, but around the country, getting their visas revoked for in one case in Tufts putting an op-ed, in another
Yeah.
case the Palestinian protests, being part of that protest. Um, how do you see that right transposing to everyone? Is it a universal right? Because I've talked to a lot of people, including people in the administration, and their argument is that the First Amendment applies to U.S. citizens alone,
Yeah.
not only people that are in the U.S. And there are rulings, there are conventions that say otherwise. Um, how do you, first of all, how do you react to those visas being revoked, and especially in universities that I believe were signatories of the Chicago Principles?
Yeah.
And yeah, how do you make of all of this?
Well, my background position is, I do work all over the world, and so and I think foreign students from foreign countries enrich our community tremendously. Like,
Oh, thank you.
if we were to restrict, yeah, present company included, but if we were to, restrict artificially the number of foreign students, as universities have been asked to do in recent weeks, that's not just bad for foreign students, that's bad for American students because they learn so much from encountering people with other countries. We all learn when we talk with people from other countries. So, in general, I think we should be open to the best minds wherever they're from, whether they're students, whether they're faculty, wherever they come from. That's my vision of how you get inquiry, right? Just want the smartest, most interesting people in debate with each other from diverse places. So that's my background view of how universities have to operate. Now, the orthodox First Amendment law, as you suggested, is that everyone has First Amendment rights if you're a foreigner in the country. Once you're in the country, you don't have any First Amendment rights outside the country.
Mm-hmm.
If you criticize Donald Trump and then apply for a visa, well, they can actually prevent you from getting that visa.
What if you have a visa and then you criticize Donald Trump? Can you get revoked?
Well, if you're in the country, the general rule is no. That would be a violation of your First Amendment right.
Okay.
But what Mahmoud Khalil, who was the Palestinian organizer at Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
was detained for was a provision in immigration law which none of us had paid much attention to, and apparently had been used very rarely, if at all, previously, which was that the Secretary of State can find anyone who's here on a visa, can find that their presence is no longer in the national security interests of the United States, and then the visa can be revoked. So that's like a blank check to Marco Rubio in our current government to just decide, any particular foreign student is somehow a threat to the U.S.
Yeah.
And you could imagine that would make sense if you had students who were, organizing violent cells or something like that. But for just engaging in speech, which would have been okay if they were American, it's, to me, not a speech-friendly administrative move. And it actually, oddly, made a real martyr out of Mahmoud Khalil. And a lot of people know his name because he was treated so unjustly. Ultimately, he got out. He had very good lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I think he's still in the country as far as I know. And, so this was a performative kind of act by the administration to try to intimidate and to try to squelch political debate. And ultimately, I think it failed. I don't think it was a good idea.
Yeah. I just want to ask another question specifically on Chicago before we move to more national matters. We talked about how institutionally the university preserves free speech, how students can engage to that, bottom up. But perhaps the most important link between the two is, faculty, right? Because students are not engaging with Paulo de Visatos every day. They're engaging with, Tom Ginsburg or whoever the professor is.
Yeah.
I talked to Dorian Abbott. He came on the podcast about a month ago, and he was giving the idea that professors, the vast majority of professors, not only in Chicago but across the country, they tend too much towards the left, and for that reason, it's not that they squash debate, but they don't help create an environment healthy for debate for conservative students or people who disagree with their views. I may be mischaracterizing, but that's the general argument. And something that he proposed was to have, in terms of hiring, in terms of dealing with faculty, having a general board that oversees hiring to ensure intellectual diversity. Because we talked about, racial diversity, background diversity, but not much intellectual diversity,
Yeah.
which may be just as important or even more important. So how do you see faculty, and more specifically the hiring and instruction of faculty, in terms of helping them engage with students in a way that helps carry our mission forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And
It's a mouthful of a question too, but
yeah,
yeah.
but I mean, it's a genuine issue. We all know that viewpoint diversity, as the name goes by, is super important, right? If the
Yeah.
goal is inquiry and the reason you have free expression is to debate ideas, then you need people who think differently and come from a variety of backgrounds, and particularly intellectual backgrounds and such. And it's also true that academic faculties, if you look as the balance between, those who support Democrats, those who support Republicans, definitely lean left, and it's become more polarized, if I can use the term, over time.
Yeah.
So that's just a sorting that's happening in terms of professions. Now, what to do about that? I don't think that itself is a problem if faculty, however they vote, are doing their job of presenting both sides of controversial issues and
Yeah.
helping students to wrestle with. There's no reason we need to make sure that there's political balance among professors.
Yeah.
And that's obvious when you think about fields like molecular engineering or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I think it's even true in the social sciences. It is a problem if professors are using the classes as an opportunity and failing to remember that core idea that we need to be debating ideas and we need to introduce students to material that they don't that they might not like. That's part of the job. That's how you learn. You wrestle with ideas that you disagree with. And unfortunately, there's some national evidence which is very disturbing on this. There was a recent study of 1 million syllabi
Hmm.
all over the country in all kinds of fields about how professors taught controversial issues. And it turns out they're not that good on things like abortion or Israel Palestine or,
Hmm.
that they tend to be one sided. And that's a problem. That's a problem. And it's not that they're only presenting propaganda or something, it's that they're presenting intellectual arguments that are valid, good, high quality scholars, but they're only on one side of the equation, and so that is a problem. So I think we do have problems with certain fields. Now,
Hmm.
what do we do about that? I don't know if I agree with Dorian, and we need some sort of oversight board. That sounds a little more bureaucratic than I'd like, but I will say that it is the job of like the
Yeah, I
provost.
think he meant that in terms of hiring and ensuring,
Right, right,
yeah.
but that there's
Still
what
bureaucratic, yeah.
right, because right now, I'm in the law school. Who decides who we're going to hire? Well, we decide because we're the ones who know what the cutting edge debates are in law, what we need.
Hmm.
That's part of academic freedom is controlling who comes in. There's a grave risk that people would let politics seep into that, and
Yeah.
I've seen it.
Yeah, and that's also a problem, right?
Yeah,
Because say there's this incredible professor who's very very to the left, but he's a genius in international law, criminal
yeah,
law, whatever it may be. You can't just not hire him, right?
no,
He's such a master in his work. Why would you not hire him?
yeah.
So that's an interesting debate. Like how do you manage those pushing political opinions with uh, allowing for free speech and allowing for them to carry their job, right?
Right. And the problem is that academic faculties can be like social clubs. Like we all know each other, we're friends, so we want to hire someone who's going to fit into our group.
Hmm.
And that could be politically or otherwise. That's really dangerous. You really want the people with the best ideas. And we would be lying if we said that that problem of self replication was not pervasive in academia. It's a big problem with academia. And there are many things you can do about it, but I think we have to admit that it can be a problem. Now, the Shills Report, which is one of our fundamental documents here at the University of Chicago,
Hmm.
prohibits that kind of consideration.
Hmm.
It says there's one criteria for hiring, and it's academic excellence, period. Not politics, not gender or race, none of that. We want people who are excellent. And that's kind of the
Yeah.
foundational rule here. And, that was adopted in 1970, reflecting, I think, what was understood to be prior practice. So if we adhere to that, we don't have to worry about what political party people are affiliated with. But I would agree it is a general problem outside, in academia and the country as a whole, and it's something we have to perturb. So, it's also a tough problem because you can't just
Yeah.
impose, I don't know, let's say you have a political science faculty and they're studying politics and they're 100% left. Well, and they want to hire someone in American politics next year. You can't just impose a second-rate conservative scholar, if that's who you could get,
Yeah.
on a bunch of first-rate liberal scholars. So it's really delicate. So I think it's our job as academics to look out for the bias. We have to tell people you always have to look out for this. And in our faculty meetings, maybe we need to remind people of the Shill's criteria. Politics is not important, neither left nor right. That actually protects everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just say, we're at an interesting moment because of the Trump administration's various attacks on higher education.
Yeah.
They are, I'm not in favor of them. I think
Yeah.
that they're, we needed surgery and we're getting a chainsaw. But, if it reminds people that free speech cuts both ways, that academic freedom cuts both ways, that we all are benefit from, institutions that do the work right. And we could sort of move the battleship of academia, because it's very hard to change any academic institution, much less academia as a whole. Move it back to a place where we're collectively, throughout the country, recommit to the core values. Well, we would be much better off.
Yeah. So it's good you mentioned Trump and the country as a whole, because I wanted to, dive deeper outside of Chicago a little bit. So, a lot's been said about what's going on with the First Amendment around, like, ever since, you had, when Biden was in power, the conservatives were like, he's attacking our free speech, he's censoring everybody. They put Trump out of Twitter, they canceled conservative speakers, whatever. And now you have, for example, Trump passing an executive order on whoever burns the American flag is going against the First Amendment, which, by the way, the Supreme Court ruled a few decades ago that's not the case.
Yeah.
So we've been having that debate from both sides, and and I think if you go outside the U.S., I think it's even a bigger problem, right? I think the worst case is the United Kingdom. I think it's truly a shame. You had more people being arrested for posting stuff on social media in the UK than in Russia this year.
Wow.
It's like it's not even close. I think it's 12,000 people or so, or something. It's like a glaring number. And you're obviously you study international law, and you put a lot of focus on how constitutions work in that scenario. How do you see the U.S. and other countries as a whole slipping towards illiberalism, or if that's the case at all, and if so, how do you see that happening?
Well, so first of all, you're right to point out the UK. It's an Online Digital Services Act, which has turned out to be a tool of repression. And it illustrates something that, distinguishes the United States from almost every other democracy, which is we don't have laws that prohibit hate speech. And, every once in a while you get some people arguing, well, how can we do that? How can we allow such, hateful racial epithets and stuff to be said without punishment? And I think the answer to that, the American answer is, well, we don't think hate speech is good. No one likes hate speech except for the hate speaker.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't trust the government. There's a cartoon in the forum you might see if you come on over. It says, hate speech is speech the government hates.
Mm-hmm.
And do we trust, the regulator?
We trust the government to select what's hate speech or
Yes,
not.
exactly. In fact, we even saw some of this with Pam Bondi saying that, anyone who said something bad about Charlie Kirk was engaged in hate speech and would be punished, which, of course, indicates a less than perfect understanding of our First Amendment.
Yeah.
But the big point is that expansive view of free expression is part of our American heritage. And I think it's good. And it might mean that we're not going to be susceptible to bad, well-meaning but repressive laws like we've seen in many other countries. What is causing the crisis of constitutional democracy? Because it is in crisis. Well, I think a lot of people think that the acceleration in, authoritarianism actually and polarization
Mm-hmm.
actually is tied to the social media. Because with social media, you just talk to the people and your views are reinforced rather than being forced in a kind of Chicago free speech way to confront ideas that you don't already agree with. And I think there's a lot to that we have sorted physically. We were even sorting by states, and we moved to the states where people think like us and such.
Hmm.
And it is certainly the case now that politics divides us more than anything else. In the 1950s, very few Americans supported interracial marriage.
Okay.
They thought it was very bad to marry across the race line. Only 5% of people supported that. If you ask people today, only less than 5% of people oppose that. The country's completely changed, and our lives are much more integrated racially than they were in the 1950s. When it comes to politics, a majority of Americans would not want their child marrying someone of the other political party.
Really?
Yeah, in other words, so politics is more divisive than race or religion or anything else now. It's become very tribal. And that's really hard to get out of, and something political scientists worry about. How do we depolarize?
Mm.
But, so that line of sort of causality be, you got the social media, people start to sort, politicians try to exploit it, and you end up with politics which are sort of winner take all in conception. And that's very hard to sustain constitutional democracy with.
Yeah.
And I don't really have a solution to all that, but I do think we're at grave risk if we think part of the solution is to suppress the speech of the people we don't like,
Mm.
on political grounds. But we're also in the midst of a huge crisis of hate speech. I mean, online hate speech is through the roof. Physical hate speech we're seeing, I think in the real world appear a lot recently. And, the free speech, the First Amendment perspective doesn't have much of an answer for that. And I don't have one either. But I do think in a university context, we do have to make sure that, people feel free to speak up and things like that. And so, we have some sort of civility demands, even though that's not really the Chicago principles say concerns about civility can never be used to suppress the discussion of an idea. And I think that's right. That is, if the idea offends you, sorry. But I think we should try to inculcate in people the point that you want to make your argument in the best, most effective way you can.
Mm.
And calling people names and using racial epithets is not an effective way to do that, to convince them of your position. So I think we have a duty to speak to each other like we're trying to convince each other, and to hear criticism like, well, maybe that person's right. We don't know. We all don't know everything about everything. So remember that we call it epistemic humility.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
So it seems like it's a more structural thing that's been going on for the past few years, that we're just, polarizing ourselves, and we don't want to engage with people that are, in different opinions. I know you kind of said that there's no answer to that, but how do we start walking back to a line where people can talk to each other again? Because you can't just say, you can't just force people to get off your phones and go to talk to people that outside of Instagram. You can't force people to do that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you can't force people to marry people that they don't agree with. So
Yeah.
how how do we do that without doing further intervention? Is there a natural path forward to go back?
I think it's a lot of work, and I do think like these Chicago ideas we've been talking about are a start. So imagine that every student who comes here knows that they're gonna at some point have to put down the phone and have a one-on-one conversation with someone coming from a completely different political viewpoint. And my experience as an adult who has relatives with very different politics and certainly some friends, is that sometimes I learn from them. And sometimes it does lead me to adjust my views. Not all the time. We still disagree about a lot of things, but that's really healthy. And having experienced it, you become much less censorious of the other side. In other words, if you've changed your mind through a conversation, then it opens up the possibility, well, maybe this thing I'm viewing online is wrong too, and maybe this person has a point. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Right now, with the Trump compact with higher education, and in general, the use of anti-discrimination law to try to get universities to do various things, to me, that's extra legal. They're acting in ways that are not consistent with the law. But it's also the case that use of anti-discrimination law to get universities to change things, that started under Obama with the Title IX stuff. And I think we have to acknowledge that maybe what it should do is people like me should say, I didn't really criticize that at the time. I was kind of irritated by the big bureaucracy that they built up and very rigid rules about sexual harassment and their sort of elimination of due process for accused students, I think I need to update my view and say, yeah, that really was wrong, and I really should have criticized it at the time much more bravely than I did at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And with that kind of process, okay, I wouldn't even take that view if I hadn't talked to Steve Kaplan, actually, who's in our business school.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing where we can update our perspective, and that'll help us when the next thing arises. We'll think more critically. We'll be clearer about what's right and wrong and such. And so we have to do that one person at a time. And if we can't do it at the University of Chicago among our students,
that's a problem.
Then it's hopeless for the country, because we've got the right values and we have the students who are interested in doing it. But it's not going to happen on its own. And that's part of the mission of the forum, just to give people opportunities. And it should be the mission of every corner of the university, too.
Yeah. That's funny because I was in the IOP, the Institute of Politics, the other day, and I had two interesting conversations regarding that. And one was with former Senator John Tester.
Oh, he was here.
He was here. He was here last year, and I got really close with him, and we were talking. And he was saying that one of the reasons why political polarization, so the lack of bipartisanship, increased so much, was a very technical one, which was that people in Congress don't stay in D.C. that much anymore, right?
Yeah.
They vote, they work, whatever. They don't stay for dinner.
Yeah.
They don't go to cocktail parties with the other people in the other party.
Yeah.
The wives don't know each other. The kids don't know each other,
Yeah.
which is a problem, right? And funny enough, I think this was last week, I was with Mary Peltola, former congresswoman from Alaska, and she was saying something really similar. She was saying the dining halls in Congress are now separated. Like, you can't...
Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah. I don't know. She didn't say if it was like a physical separation or like just a mental separation, but she said, well, if you're a Republican and you're having lunch with a Democrat, people are going to start asking questions. So that's extremely concerning to me. And it's funny that you mentioned that's the way we solve things, because if it is, I'm not really optimistic.
Yeah, but Congress is especially bad. What you're describing reminds me of like prison gangs and stuff.
Yeah,
By
exactly.
race, you can't white person can't eat at the black table and vice versa. And so that tribalism obviously is dangerous. It's a gang mentality. But the reason we have it is constitutional, ultimately. It's the Constitution allows states to draw the lines. We have the gerrymandering problem.
Yeah.
And that means you have, as commonly said, instead of the voters picking the politicians pick their voters in terms of drawing the lines. And in that kind of situation, there's no incentive for anyone to reach across the line. Now, someone like John Tester had to reach across the line to be a senator. Heidi Heitkamp as well.
Yeah.
These are senators from rural states, and those kind of folks are really important. And we have a few in the swing districts, but the number of swing districts is shrinking because of gerrymandering. So that's a solvable problem, actually. It's
Tackle gerrymandering?
Yeah, I mean, it's solvable technically. And but I guess what I fear is that, a situation where the Congress is more polarized than the country, which is generally true. Voters are not as polarized as Congress, but they have an incentive to continue to deepen the polarization of the voters.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, presidential elections are not decided by the hardcore partisans of either team. They're decided by people in the middle who tend to be what we call low information voters. They don't know much about politics. They have kind of a sense or a mood. So that means we're making electoral decisions not on the basis of the most moderate person in terms who's thought about issues, but on the basis of whoever, the opinions of the least informed person in the country. So that's bad. We're not doing it. Yeah. But that's what my book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, is about. Like how constitutional solutions we see in other countries that can help to improve things.
Yeah. That's interesting. I was having a similar conversation on how access to voting affect that type of situation. And an argument that I saw was, I don't know if I agree with it, but I wanted to hear your opinion on something in that matter is, for you to be able to vote, you should have to take a civics test.
Yeah.
You should have to understand what are the three powers. You should understand what's the difference between the House and Senate. You should have a basic understanding of what our country is. And if you don't have that basic understanding, you shouldn't have a say on what our country does. Uh, so more broadly, I wanted to understand from you, how do you pull back from this bipartisanship, this lack of bipartisanship, and this go back to a more civil state in politics without infringing voters' rights? And if so, how do you do that in a civil manner?
Yeah. Well, I'm obviously not in favor of a citizenship test, but we ought to be embarrassed as a country that very few
Why
Americans.
why wouldn't you be in favor? Like,
Well, because it's paternalistic. Like some people, I do think the people ultimately are the ones who get to decide. If the people want to vote us to hell, they're allowed to do it, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said.
mhm,
So, that's just a belief in democracy ultimately.
yeah,
But, it is embarrassing. We ought to be embarrassed as a country that so few Americans could pass the citizenship test, the test needed to become a citizen if you're an immigrant. So immigrants are very high quality voters in that sense. They understand the system. But it's embarrassing. And so the solution to me is a lot more civic education,
hmm
just a lot more civic education at the high school level. It's highly decentralized, so it's hard to impose that. But I don't see any problem with having civics being a major requirement again. And I think that would help us. Now, would it depolarize us? I'm not so sure. Depolarization, there's comparative research on it. It's very hard. We don't have the United States right now is one of the most polarized electorates in history,
yeah,
of any country. And that's a very dangerous situation because when you're really polarized, then the idea of the other side winning an election is so scary to you that you might resort to violence, right? You might try to shut it down. It's the equivalent of the shutting down a speaker in a
yeah,
university, right? And so we can't allow that. And yet we do now see an uptake in political violence. It is by both sides without question. And there's a lot of data on that. But it turns every election into an existential crisis. And I really worry about that. How do you depolarize? The examples seem to involve war, unfortunately. That is, we unify when there's some external enemy who's kind of come along and threaten us. And that's not a problem for the United States, not likely to be a solution for us because we are such a powerful nation militarily.
yeah.
But who knows? We're going to find out. I do think we have to start sort of at the grassroots level, one person at a time, educating people one school at a time. And just remember, these are our ideals, and they're good ideals, even if they're not always implemented perfectly.
hmm And in terms of the United States government, the structure of our voting system also doesn't doesn't favor bipartisanship. Doesn't favor a centrist candidate winning. Right? We have the primary system, which people that vote in primary. Well, first of all, like most of the counties are either super red or super blue.
Yeah.
So the real election is the primary election,
Yeah.
and the people that vote in the primaries are way. It's not a lot of people, especially when compared to the people that vote in the general election.
Yeah.
So what you have is, in practice, you have a very tiny amount of people who vote in the primaries deciding a vast majority of Congress people, and these people that vote in the primaries, they tend to be more more radical. They tend to be more passionate about politics. They tend to know more,
Yeah.
but they also tend to have more radical opinions. Is that something that concerns you? If so, how do we change our political system structurally to tackle problems like this?
Yeah. So politics changed in the United States when we went to primaries rather than smoke-filled backroom deals.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't put that genie back in the bottle. Actually, if there's one party which is engaging in the smoky backroom deal making, it's the Democrats
Mm-hmm.
because the last couple of cycles they have not the Biden cycle but the 2016 cycle where allegedly Obama said to Biden it's Hillary's turn, and that didn't work out for them. And then in the 24 cycle where whatever happened they
Yeah.
just went with Biden in the face of their voters. and then chose Harris, that by fiat, that shows that elitism isn't working. People want a choice in their voters. So ultimately, you have to rely on voters, the primary voters, to have the foresight that there's going to be a second stage of the election. They need to be thinking about not just who's the most extreme, closest to my views, but who's going to be able to win. And actually, on that one, the Democratic Party has been a little better than the Republicans, I think, in the sense that,
Yeah, but that's not a problem for most counties because in most counties,
yeah,
Republicans are always going to win or Democrats are always going to win.
but
So,
which Republican? I mean, you see it here in the city of Chicago. We're a one-party city,
yeah,
right? And so which Democrat is going to win? Do you have the more moderate or who would be a bigger tent person, or do you have the more radical person? I would say that Biden was the most moderate Democrat in that 2020 cycle. And so the Democratic voters were able, through voting, to pick the guy, and it obviously worked, who beat Donald Trump.
yeah, yeah. But that's in the national stage. In the national stage,
Yeah.
there's no certainty that the Democrats or Republicans are going to win.
Well, that's right. So
Yeah,
you're saying within counties, like at local government, is that what you're asking about? Or are you saying?
yeah. In counties and in congressional districts, for
Yeah,
example.
no,
Yeah,
that's absolutely. Congressional districts is a huge problem
yeah,
because that is the source of the polarization, right? That you get a group in Congress in very safe red districts. They don't get any points. In fact, if they compromise, they would be accused of being a traitor. I
that's right.
actually give money to people. I'm unusual. I give money to people on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah,
And I do that especially, and I'm not a Republican, but I'm an independent now, I should say, for the record.
mm,
But if I see a Republican who is cooperating to do something that's good for the country, I send them some change. I think that's really good. Like the tariffs in Brazil now.
yeah,
We just had 5 senators stand up for that. 4 senators, I think, on the Republican side, and that's really important. They should
yeah,
they should know that when they do something brave, because it is brave in that context,
mm,
that they're getting some support.
yeah,
So otherwise, it's important for all of us to speak out, basically. And in my case, pretty moderate person, support moderates, support people who are willing to do things that I think are good for the country rather than do things that are going to get them reelected.
mm. Just a final question before we wrap things up here. So we talked broadly about, your Chicago. We talked broadly about the country and the West as a whole, and our what's going on with our liberties. I was thinking, um, how do you see the Western countries, specifically the U.S., but as we mentioned, the U.K. or so forth, moving in the next 5 to 10 years as a status quo, right? If we are today, what's going to happen in the next 5, 10 years?
Yeah.
And what do you think will actually happen? Do you think there's going to be a different reaction that's going to stir us away from that?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, first of all, one of the interesting things about the West is it's a set of countries that where developments in one country do influence another, right? So we see, a Donald Trump will incentivize the victory of Javier Milei, for
Yeah.
example.
Or the loss of the conservatives in Canada.
Yes,
Yeah.
but then right, exactly, the loss of the conservative in Canada and Australia as well. Like it's
Hmm.
just there's sort of reactions one way or the other. At the end of the day, structurally, the West is the West.
Hmm.
None of us really want to be in a China-dominated world. We know that would not be good for liberty, and so hopefully there will be a kind of modus vivendi, I suppose, where we agree to put aside differences, act strategically in the interests of our countries, and also act in a way that is not hostile or not what's the word aggressively escalatory when it comes to China. Right? This is the stuff that really matters. Americans don't realize that for many people around the world, war is really a very
It's a
present
threat.
memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also Latin Americans don't really realize that either because you haven't really had interstate war for quite a long
That's
time.
right.
But, in the normal country, in Europe, I used to live in Europe, the old people when I was there, it was very real to them. And we're now seeing more wars in the world today than many decades. So the world is the peaceful 30 years, glorious years we've had since the end of the Cold War, clearly are coming to an end, but we don't really know what's going to happen next, obviously. And what I would like to see, of course, is a recommitment to constitutional democracy. I worry about some of the big countries really following the Hungarian path, where there's not really any electoral competition.
Hmm.
That would be a disaster for me. That would be a victory for Vladimir Putin, I'm not the biggest fan of. And I think those are the kinds of things I'd like to see. What will happen? Hard to know. But I am, at the end of the day, a believer in democracy. That is, I believe in the long run, people get things right with a lot of wrong turns along the way. That's the way it works. That's the way American history has been. And I'm hopeful that this experience we're undergoing now will lead to, a new wave of legislation which protects our institutions and improves our institutions, because they're not great. There's a lot of improvements to be made.
Hmm.
That's what I'd like to see for this country. But it's a heavy time, and I really do worry a lot about the 2028 election going peacefully.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you very much for coming, Professor. This was really fun and a lot of great insights to be taken out of this conversation. So thank you very much for your time, and for the viewer, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Eduardo. I always like to think with the thinker.
I appreciate it. Thank you.